Barbara. Leslie, thank you very much for those kind words. And fellows and guests, I feel very honoured to be talking to you tonight. Somebody said to me, "Aren't you nervous?" I said, no, I feel I'm amongst friends, because the last 3 years has been a tremendous opportunity to get to know so many of you and to feel that we are all in a friendship society together. Well, tonight, the theme of commemoration of the medieval past I've chosen as what seemed to me to be an interesting and rather novel idea to talk about at the end of my 3-year term as president, because it is in some ways linked to the Society's concern with antiquities. And I've also recently developed a personal interest in commemoration, which I'll reveal at the end. Now, commemoration has, of course, been a theme of great interest to many historians, more usually concerning modern history and the world wars. Dictionary definitions are concerned with recalling an event, calling to remembrance, and that was the title of the motet, which you may have heard playing as you came in before the noise of talking drowned out that very fine motet by Richard Farrant. Calling to remembrance by a solemn or public act, showing respect for a memory of a person and preserving that memory by a public memorial or event. And of course, in many very impressive ways, this has been freshly experienced in the events of the past week for us. A fairly general definition might be that of collective memory for all social groups, from family to nation. That's probably as far as it goes. Commemoration on a more global scale is not, I think, so meaningful. Commemorating the medieval past in many and diverse ways is without doubt an important element in keeping knowledge of our medieval heritage alive in modern times. And the idea of commemoration has particular links with the medieval world. The medieval commemoration of the dead was an important aspect of liturgical practice, and the commemoration of lesser saints is still a part of the Catholic liturgy. Now, while we're looking at the Wallace Monument, I'll start off by focusing on this iconic memorial to Scotland's medieval hero, who has been commemorated more magnificently with this monument than any other medieval secular figure. It is a quite extraordinary achievement, both architecturally and culturally, and it's also a very interesting manifestation of Scottish national sentiment in accord with the national romantic movement which was sweeping across Europe at the time it was conceived and designed and built in the 1860s. Has any other national hero been given such an outstanding and prominent commemorative symbol? Not very many, and not, I think, in the same way. What is very topical and interesting is that this year was the 150th anniversary of the laying of the foundation stone of the original building, and events took place in June which really were a commemoration of the original commemoration. That might be something of a first, and the start of a new re-commemorative process. Well, I visited the Wallace Monument for the very first time in my life a week ago last Saturday, which was when the stunning conditions of the fog swirling around the tower and in the Forth Valley below provided. Here we are, looking out, of course, across the Forth towards the field of the Battle of Stirling Bridge, with Stirling Castle in the distance. I'd really not been much interested in the Wallace Monument or ever visiting it, but I had a young Norwegian visitor to entertain for the day, so it seemed like a good place to take her and for me to experience it in advance of this lecture. Her positive reaction to the site and the monument and its demonstration of the hero Wallace's place in the national story made me see it all in a rather different light, as did the history of the creation and funding of the monument. So I decided to start off my commemoration lecture with some focus on Wallace, which was not at all what I had intended to do originally. This is one of the levels in the tower, showing other Wallace monuments, as it describes them. Over 20 statues of Wallace have been erected in different parts of the country, and others in other countries of the Commonwealth particularly. And these are the sites of the many memorial monuments which are detailed here. One aspect of the Wallace cult emerged from my visitor experience and attracted my interest as a medieval historian. Wallace met a horrible death and can therefore very simply be regarded as a martyr to the national cause. And this probably gives his cult an edge over Robert Bruce's. A violent death in a good cause, and especially a national cause, was enough to create saints in the 12th century, and echoes of such a comparison with Wallace's death may be a factor in the remarkable lasting esteem in which he's been held over the centuries. Perhaps the sweeping tide of national fervour which swept him to the forefront of the nation's regard in the 1860s, and which helped to create this iconic building, was underpinned by a certain amount of hero worship and personal cult aroused by his violent death. But there are many other aspects of the commemoration of the medieval past which I want to explore, so I'll move on. And I'll say at this point that I've put in the parameters from Shetland to St Andrews, because those are two parts of Scotland that I'm particularly concerned with, but I'll be straying out of that line of latitude to look at some other places. So how has the medieval past been commemorated in Scotland? I'm going to start with institutional commemoration, for this was a definite feature of collective memory. Donations and benefactions which were made for pious purposes are a well-known and distinctive feature of the medieval age. And that word commemoration has come to have a particular association with those benefactors of universities or other religious institutions founded in the Middle Ages and which survived the destruction of those institutions in the Reformation period. And these are primarily our universities with a pre-Reformation origin. It's well known that the great festival of Oxford's academic year is Commemoration, usually on the third Wednesday after Trinity Sunday, because it's the occasion when the commemoration balls are held. But Scotland's medieval universities also commemorate their benefactors to a degree. And the University of Glasgow has a commemoration day with the conferring of honorary degrees and a lunch, extending as far back as 1492. As you can see here, the annual May banquet was held first in 1492, and the toast Resurgat in Gloria Alma Mater was there proposed. And commemoration at Glasgow became an official event in the late 17th century. The Commissioners of Visitation of 1690 appointed that at all yearly laureations there be honourable mention made of the founders and benefactors by public, with a K, recital. This was observed, and the act of commemoration took place at the close of the annual graduation ceremony. Aberdeen had its famous founder, Bishop Elphinstone, and Aberdeen and St Andrews both commemorate their benefactors each year in February on Founders' Day, but at neither university does the tradition go anywhere like as far back as it does at Glasgow. Although there must have been commemoration ceremonies, no doubt, in the early days, but there doesn't seem to be much record of them. As far as St Andrews goes, it's really the annual KK procession, the Kate Kennedy procession, which is the most well-known and public celebration of St Andrews' history. And it does indeed commemorate famous figures in the university's past, both medieval and modern, particularly the founder of St Salvator's College, Bishop James Kennedy, and his niece Kate, who formed the chief tableau in the procession. And those of you with St Andrews connections will know that, of course, it's a first-year male undergraduate who is chosen to play the part of Kate. Well, there's been a lot of controversy over the KK procession in recent years, which I'm not going to go into, but it's hoped that it does survive these stormy waters because it's a great showcase for St Andrews' medieval origins and an occasion when the general public can share in and enjoy a student pageant. So the act of commemoration is, or should be, an important part of the collective memory of our oldest institutions. Now, revival, or recreation of the medieval past, is an important aspect also. And one can't avoid it in a way because the whole romantic revival of interest in the Middle Ages, sparked off by Scott's novels, is enormously influential. And it's an important adjunct to the commemorative process, for it really did help to popularise the medieval past. Well, as president of the Society of Antiquaries, I'm quite happy to recognise that this revival of interest was encouraged by antiquarianism. It's at the basis of the Society's activities, it was an incentive for our foundation, and I think we should recognise its continuing relevance to our activities. The Eglinton Tournament of 1839 is considered to be an early manifestation of the Romantic revival of interest in the medieval past, and it's a good starting point for our consideration of this revival process. It was the reenactment of a medieval joust, funded and organised by the Earl of Eglinton at Eglinton Castle near Kilwinning, which created a storm of interest and attracted over 100,000 spectators, but which got mired down in thunderstorms of freak severity. It was an exceedingly ambitious and, in many respects, professional enterprise. It brought a great deal of income to the local economy, just as medieval fairs and reenactments are intended to do today. Indeed, the Wikipedia entry on the Eglinton tournament comments that it is an ancestor to today's growth industry of living history. The Earl himself said, "I'm aware it was a very humble imitation of the scenes which my imagination had portrayed, but I have at least done something towards the revival of chivalry," which is probably more than can be said for the film Braveheart. And that's the only reference I'm going to make to the film Braveheart. While the scenes which his imagination had portrayed is perhaps a poignant reminder of what inspires the attempts of many to commemorate the medieval past. However, Queen Victoria called the Eglinton tournament a foolish amusement, noting in her diary that it had turned out to be the greatest absurdity. It was the object of derision of many of the Whigs of the time, and the Spectator hoped that England, NB, had seen the final meeting of the Eglinton Patent Emasculated Mopstick Middle Ages Recovery Society. Well, moving on from the Eglinton tournament to a modern-day version, the Bruce Festival, an open-air medieval event which also attracts pretty large numbers, 16,000, their website says, not quite as many as the Eglinton tournament, but the Bruce Festival, of course, takes place every year. And it is said to be the only celebration of its kind in Scotland, really bringing alive the drama of medieval Scotland. The event clearly commemorates the national hero and the place of Dunfermline in the national story. And local interest in their important place in medieval Scotland is a notable phenomenon of the commemorative process, one which I've become very aware of while reading up about this. Pageants, of course, have for some time been a popular way of commemorating past events, although today the term seems to have been replaced by reenactments. So this is a statement in the website. They aim to bring Bruce and Dunfermline itself back to its rightful central place in the story of the nation. Well, looking at pageants in a little more detail, pageants themselves are, of course, a medieval phenomenon. A medieval pageant was a form of procession, traditionally associated with both secular and religious rituals, often with a narrative structure. And it was an important aspect of seasonal festivals throughout Europe, in particular focusing around the celebration of the Feast of Corpus Christi, which began after the 13th century. The mystery plays are another aspect of this as well, and they were revived in both York and Chester as part of the Festival of Britain. And I'm mentioning that because as a schoolgirl I was present at the York revival in 1951 of the medieval mystery play of York, when Judi Dench played the Virgin Mary, her first public role, acting role. Well, pageants in Scotland are an important aspect also of the commemoration of medieval practices. Such events were popular between the wars, and the most famous of them was the Scottish historical pageant at Craigmillar Castle, which centred round the Battle of Flodden. It coincided with the opening ceremony of the Scottish National War Memorial at Edinburgh Castle. It's been called, or it was called at the time, by one commentator, a hierarchical, paternalistic and royalist vision of society. But it was a very popular vision between the wars, and it brought in the role of Flodden in national history, and I'll be coming back to Flodden later on. Perhaps the most significant of such pageants from the commemorative aspect are those have been put on in Arbroath. The Arbroath Abbey Pageant Society was founded in 1947 by local citizens for the very specific purpose of commemorating and promoting a high point in the history not only of Arbroath, but for all free peoples, the signing of the Declaration of Arbroath on the 6th of April within the walls of Arbroath Abbey. And here a commemorative postal issue that was brought out on the 650th anniversary date. The Society regularly performed a spectacular and colourful pageant reenacting the event until 1981, and then a rather bad fire destroyed, well, the website says everything. I assume this means the materials that the Pageant Society had. Then it was revived again in 1999 to mark the 400th anniversary of Arbroath's Royal Charter. And since then, the Society has staged full pageants in 2000, 2005, as well as marking the 6th of April every year with a special commemorative event. And here we can see some rather dramatic illustrations of that event. Abbot Bernard, well, I was going to invite the King to sign the charter, and then of course I realised that was a fatal mistake, so there is Abbot Bernard inviting the King to do some steps to go for a drink. We also have now, fairly recently erected on the outskirts of Arbroath, a very fine statue, a commemorative statue, which perhaps unhistorically but very dramatically shows the Abbot and King Robert flourishing the declaration between them. Again, it is a local commemorative event for Arbroath, very important for increasing local awareness of the former importance of a place where national events happened. I had written in that sentence the former importance of a place which is no longer so important, but I decided that perhaps was not very tactful if any denizens of Arbroath were in the audience, so I changed it to where national events did happen in the past. Well, leaving community events for the moment, I want to move on to bring in an individual who did more than any other to recreate and preserve Scotland's medieval past in a visual way, very differently therefore from Sir Walter Scott. And he is becoming something of a hero to me. This is the 3rd Marquis of Bute. Here he's seen in the robes of Rector of St Andrews University, and he was Rector twice, and it's believed that he designed these rectorial robes, the gown, which is said to be based on Lawrence of Lindore's robes, but this is all just hearsay. We're trying to sort out what the basis of the veracity of this belief is, but at the moment we haven't exactly ascertained that, but it's said to be based on Lawrence of Lindore's robes. Well, the Marquis's great-grandfather, the 3rd Earl, had of course been the first president of the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland, my predecessor, and so John Crichton Stewart was a member of a lineage which cared very much about the preservation of Scotland's antiquities. It was the 3rd Marquis's conversion to the Roman Church which gave him an ideological attachment to the medieval age and all things medieval. He did more than any man of his generation to preserve and secure for posterity the venerable and priceless relics of his country's past, says his biographer. And for instance, something I learnt recently from a colleague in the muniments in St Andrews was that he paid for the transcription of the earliest records of St Andrews University. That was the title deeds within the inventory papers of the colleges. This has therefore provided a 19th century ink transcription of the university's medieval Latin and Scots documents, which is still used, is still very useful. And it's further direct evidence of his close engagement with the university's medieval past. He was absolutely exceptional in his total involvement with that medieval past, which led to the extraordinary care and money which he lavished on so many relics of Scotland's medieval heritage. Falkland Palace, the priory buildings of St Andrew's Cathedral complex, and he wanted the cathedral to be restored to function as a university church. Greyfriars Church in Elgin, Pluscaden Priory, as well as several of the medieval churches in Bute itself. The contribution to the Hall of Heroes in the Wallace Monument was his gift of the bust of Robert Bruce, which, it could be said, is possibly the most prestigious of all the heroes represented in the Wallace Monument. I have, just as an aside, to tell you something that I found very interesting in reading about the 3rd Marquis. He visited Orkney twice, and Kirkwall Cathedral and the Church of St Magnus on the Isle of Egglesey fascinated him with their links with the island saint. He was allowed to view the relics, which were taken from their resting place in the nave pillar, and the authenticity of which he actually expressed some doubts about. When he got to Egglesey, he fell on his knees and kissed the ground. He was very knowledgeable about liturgical matters and their religious associations with the cult of saints. Once commenting to a lady in a London drawing room, apropos of nothing in particular, Isn't it perfectly monstrous that St Magnus hasn't got an octave? His biographer, David Hunter Blair, adds, what the lady said or thought is not recorded. Well, as well as preserving medieval relics, he recreated and built anew. And there are many of you here who will know a great deal more about the Third Marquess's architectural achievements and the building of Mount Stuart than I do. In fact, my introduction to Mount Stuart was very late in life, only last year, in fact. And words really do fail one to give an adequate description of this towering, emblematic hommage au Moyen Âge. The Mount Stuart website calls it a monument to the obsession with the medieval past. Well, of course, he was obsessed with the medieval past. Some of us are obsessed with the medieval past, but we hope that good things do come out of that. And this building is a recreation of the Middle Ages, in some ways, everything that a recreation should be, and something of what it should not, in its mixture of form and function. It's eclectic and it's inspiring, although it does not commemorate medieval Scotland to any great degree. It's drawing its inspiration from many other medieval buildings in Europe. However, decorative elements were commissioned which very much do focus on and commemorate Scotland's medieval past. And the most remarkable is H.W. Lonsdale's frieze in the family bedroom, a masterpiece beautifully restored, illustrating events in the life of Margaret, Queen of Scotland, commemorating the Marquess's family links with the Royal Scottish dynasty, which of course descended from Margaret and Malcolm. And he was very proud indeed of his dynastic connections, as is evident from the bedroom ceiling, which is emblazoned with heraldic shields of all the marriages from the 14th century Sheriff of Bute to the Marquess's own marriage, so he could lie on his back in bed and look at all his the marriages of all his ancestors, or the heraldic emblems signifying them. Friezes of a more public kind, and I'm leaving, sadly, I'm leaving Mount Stuart and Bute behind. Friezes of a more public kind are among the most dramatic evocation of Scotland's medieval history. None more so than the William Hole frieze in the National Portrait Gallery. And, as of course many of you will know, the building itself, opened in 1890, was funded and endowed by John Ritchie Finlay, the chief proprietor of the Scotsman, and a fantastic legacy to the medieval heritage of Scotland. The plaque says that it is dedicated to the illustration of Scottish history, and of course it was built by Rowan Anderson, who of course was also involved in Mount Stuart as well. And it created a modern purpose-designed art gallery to rival the most advanced at the time in Europe and America. And Findlay wanted his building to be a shrine for Scotland's heroes. And of course we're all looking forward to going back and revisiting the National Portrait Gallery when it opens again after refurbishment next month. The facade has a superb collection of historical figures, many of them from the medieval past, with Wallace and Bruce guarding the entrance, and Queen Margaret higher up, holding a model of Dunfermline Abbey in her hand. And I might add, again, linking up with the Society, that the core of the collection of portraits in the National Portrait Gallery, which formed its foundation in its first conception, was the collection of David Erskine, 11th Earl of Buchan, who was also the founder of our society. Well, the Hole frieze, the William Hole frieze in the front hall, is a magnificent depiction of in this instance, the medieval kings of Scotland, and one medieval king of England whom you might spy, but also, of course, it's a frieze of all the heroes of Scottish history. And another frame I've taken from it is of the Scotland Saints, the depiction of Scotland's saints, which is a very fine collection, bringing them all together. And I am actually not going to be saying very much about Scotland's saints, the commemoration of Scotland's early saints, because really, in a way, that is a separate item. Yes, there are a few Vikings there as well. And I was rather impressed by another frieze, less colourful but very impressive and informative. This is a frieze which I saw at Bannockburn in the activity room, in the upper walls of the activity room. And I've tried to find out who did draw these figures. Somebody here may know that. I've been trying to get in touch with the National Trust to find out, but I haven't yet found out. But I think it's a very fine collection of famous figures from the medieval past, and I hope very much that it'll be retained for the new interpretation centre, which is planned for the 700th anniversary of the battle. Well, this brings me to battle sites and the commemoration of nations' victories, and also of defeats, or one defeat. I believe the site of the Battle of Bannockburn is going to be relaid out for 2014, and I'm sure that Pilkington Jackson's iconic statue of the Bruce on horseback will be retained as a centrepiece. Here I took this slide in order just to show how close it is to Stirling. You can just spy Stirling Castle in the distance, but if they don't chop those trees down, it's soon going to be difficult to see Stirling Castle in the distance. But it does show what a central place geographically, as well as historically, the Battle of Bannockburn has in Scotland's history. Bruce and Wallace are the two medieval heroes commemorated by statue in public places more than any others. I think I said there were over 20 statues of Wallace. Well, there are certainly over 20 of Bruce, but exactly whether one has more than the other, I'm not very sure. But these statues commemorate the national struggle against the English invader, and they keep Scottish identity visible at our places. And statues are intended to do that, and for Scotland these are icons for all the people, which rather counters Raphael Samuel's statement that commemoration is regarded, by historians anyway, he says, as a cheat imposed by the ruling elite. I don't think that's the case in Scotland. Here we have Bruce on the esplanade at Stirling Castle, and the stained glass image comes from the Wallace monument as well. And then the newest statue of Bruce is outside Marischal College in Aberdeen. This one actually commemorates a more local event, the granting of a burgher charter to Aberdeen, which rings the changes rather nicely. And it is a stunning image of the king on a rather more lively horse than the begowned equine version at Bannockburn. Yes, there is a pigeon on top of the burgher charter. But of course the battle site which has inspired more commemorative activity than any other is Flodden. The latter part of the 19th century saw a developing interest in public commemoration, which was demonstrated by centenaries and the importance of significant dates. In the borders there was a linking of the common riding rituals staged by the civic authorities in the border towns to incorporate Flodden traditions. Selkirk drew upon the traditions of the sole remaining suitor from Flodden who arrived with the captured banner from the battlefield, and this is a statue of the Callants statue at Hawick. This is really commemorating the later skirmish which took place at Horns Hole nearby. It's the following year when a group of Terrys routed a superior force of English marauders, and the flag they're supposed to have captured was incorporated into the common ridings in a conscious echo of Selkirk's invented tradition. And Galashiels and Coldstream also use a Flodden theme in their own civic rituals. So commemoration of Flodden has become, apparently, a significant factor in the development of a vibrant borders identity. Strange that a national defeat of disastrous proportions should have been such an important trigger for the growth of national and especially local pride. The battlefield memorial, erected in 1910, led the way for the public commemoration on the 400th anniversary, and of course we're now approaching the 500th anniversary. And I'm grateful to Katie Stevenson and Gordon Paintland for allowing me to see a forthcoming study which they are preparing on the commemoration of the Battle of Flodden from 1513 to 2013. There are many complex aspects to the whole concept of Flodden commemorations, such as national versus local traditions, and even more so the local rivalries between the border towns. And of course, as I've said already, there is this extraordinary focus on a national defeat. But one thing can be said for sure, and that is that the commemoration of Flodden has been a live issue for generations of Scots and denizens of the border towns, and will undoubtedly continue to be so with the approach of the 500th anniversary. And that can only be a good thing for maintaining knowledge of the country's medieval past among younger generations. Another national medieval battle site where the foreign invader was challenged, and in this instance repulsed, is Largs in Ayrshire, although its significance is nothing like as national as Flodden's. This battle was fought against the naval troops of the Kingdom of Norway, led by their king, Håkon Håkonsson, over the only other frontier, apart from the southern border, which the Scottish kingdom shared with a foreign neighbour. This frontier, of course, was a maritime one, and the invader came with a fleet of longships in September 1263. It was more of a skirmish than anything else, as the September gales had destroyed some of the longships, and the numbers actually fighting must have been quite small. One wonders why the Norwegians attempted to land and fight at all, but they were effectively repulsed by the Ayrshire levies. And the site, or a site in the vicinity, where the longships were drawn up and the skirmish ensued, is marked by this simple monument called locally the Pencil. It's actually modelled on the Brechin Round Tower, so it is a model of a 10th century round tower, which at one time, and no doubt at the time that this monument was erected, was believed to be a defence against Vikings. The round towers are now considered to have perhaps different origins, different purposes, although they may have also acted as centres to defend themselves in when the Vikings arrived. But it is a very fine recreation of the Brechin Round Tower, particularly the doorway, as you can see, is very faithfully modelled on the doorway in the Round Tower of Brechin. Well, the failure of the invasion, of course, led to King Håkon retreating back north to the Orkney Islands, where he stayed the winter, but this monument serves a useful purpose in marking the locality where the encounter took place, and in helping to keep alive the memory of the days when the offshore islands were all under Norwegian power. It helps to give Largs an important place in the history of Scotland's relations with the Vikings, and it's meant that the site of the former Viking cinema is now a Viking heritage centre. And a Viking fair is held every September. Good for tourism, and good for helping to keep the memory of the Vikings alive as a factor in the history of Western Scotland. Well, I'm now going to focus on some other aspects of local commemorative activities relating to the medieval past. And one aspect, and a very interesting, important aspect, is now the revival of in recent years of pilgrimages, or quasi-pilgrimages perhaps, through which people are discovering the significance, social, cultural, or indeed religious, of travelling, preferably on foot, to places which have been of importance in the life of the medieval church, especially in the life of medieval saints. Indeed, the ecological component is becoming a fast-growing motive for pilgrimages, especially, and I learnt from Radio 4 last week, to sites connected with St. Francis of Assisi. So for many reasons, pilgrimages are continuing to commemorate the life and work of saints who were important in the religious world of medieval Scotland. And this proposed pilgrim's trail through Ayrshire to Whithorn is aiming for what has always been one of the most significant pilgrimage centres in Scotland, the site of St. Ninian's Church and his cave, and the cradle of Christianity in this part of Scotland. Well, as regards pilgrimages, one of course can't not mention Iona and Columba, especially with Ian Fisher in the audience. And pilgrimages to Iona are of course central to Scottish religious life and a very important reminder of the early medieval past. And indeed showing veneration for a saint who in many respects should be Scotland's national saint. But there are other, less well-known places which have developed their own events around saintly figures such as Innerleithen's festival of St. Ronan. I knew nothing about this till I came across it on looking up pilgrimages on Google, and it's a very interesting annual festival which is founded on the, I'm sure, mistaken belief that the town was founded by St. Ronan in AD 737. He came to Innerleithen via the River Tweed in a coracle, and according to local legend, St. Ronan clicked the deal by the hind leg and banished him, which you can see he's doing in the banner there. Sir Walter Scott's novel, St. Ronan's Well, was set in and around Innerleithen, and Scott helped to formalise the legend of St. Ronan and linking the town with its patron saint. And in 1827, James Hogg, the Ettrick shepherd, instituted St. Ronan's Border Games, which are still held and recognised as the oldest organised sports meeting in Scotland, or so the website says. The Border Games are held every year in July, a 10-day festival drawing enthusiastic crowds with local and tourist participation. One little saintly figure who's been commemorated assiduously as a queen and mother of kings and queens, as well as a saint, is of course Margaret, wife of Malcolm Canmore. It is slightly surprising that this remarkable woman has maintained her popularity as a saint, although as I went to a Queen Margaret school, I was certainly brought up with her as a model to us, a saintly and a queenly model. Perhaps her Englishness was to some extent forgiven north of the border because she came as an exile fleeing from the dreaded Norman conquerors. But the Seaton Armorial of 1591 does show that her reputation, not as a saint, but she's not mentioned as a saint here, but as a queen, does go back a long time. She's got on her front the what is supposed to be Edward the Confessor's armorial, the bird, the cross with the 4 birds, the martlets, I think they're called. She does look a little bit like Mrs. Thatcher, I have to say. And then the 900th anniversary of her death was an occasion for much commemorative activity, especially in Dunfermline, where St Margaret's Cave was reopened and turned into a sort of shrine. So we are back in Dunfermline, which is also able to benefit from the close association with Margaret and the commemoration of her life. Margaret has some facets for the remembrance game. One is the contemporary biography by her confessor, Bishop Turgot, written at the behest of her daughter, Edith, Queen of England. And that helped in the process of canonization and the translation of her relics to the newly built Lady Chapel in 1250, and that is, on the left is the site of Margaret's shrine and where the Lady Chapel once existed. And the poster on the right is a fine recreation of the translation procession. Another favourability factor is her gender. One has to say that female saints are in short supply in Scotland. And she does make a very good subject for stained glass images. Of course, her queenly and maternal status probably did provide an important human reality in her commemoration. It's interesting that the window in Madity Kirk is dedicated to those women who laboured from 1914 to 1919 during the First World War. And then the image of her at Melsetter Chapel in Orkney shows her with her bag discharging largesse to the poor, and of course with a child at her feet, because she did gather children round her, and is told in her biography that by Turgot that she fed these poor people. Well, that's as much as I'm going to say about Margaret. What I wanted. I'm going to move on now to a very different sort of saintly figure, male heroes of much lower status than Margaret, but who deserve to be commemorated, and indeed who are commemorated in St Andrews, the early Protestant martyrs. This is the mark in the pavement outside St Salvator's College, which those of you who've been students at St Andrews will know well, because you never trod on it, because if you did, you would fail your exams. And he was burnt at the stake in 1528. And then we also have the Martyrial, which is in a rather poor state at the moment, but it commemorates not only Patrick Hamilton, but Henry Forrest, George Wishart, and Walter Mill. And we should accord these men remembrance for their bravery in the face of a dreadful death, for which they deserve to be sanctified, not that they themselves or the Reformed Church would have wished it, of course. Right, I'm moving north now, I'm the religiously commemorated, and following Sir Walter Scott's lead, as always, coming to Perth, where the characters from his novel The Fair Maid of Perth are presented in some rather fine stained glass windows in the City Council chamber. Here we can see Robert III and Lord Provost Charteris, who is a descendant of de Longueville. I'll be coming to de Longueville in a moment. And here we have images of Catherine Glover, the fair maid, and her father, and her suitor, Hal of the Wynd. And then there is also a patriotic window, or 2 patriotic windows, showing Robert Bruce taking the city of Perth in 1313, leading his men across the moat, scaling the town wall, along with de Longueville. And is of the Glee Maiden, and I'm sorry I can tell you nothing about the Glee Maiden, but it's just a very nice stained glass image of her. I presume she comes into the story, but as I've never read The Fair Maid of Perth, and I'm going to have to rectify that. I'm not too sure who the Glee Maiden was. But that plaque is another fine image of a commemoration, but it's a much later commemoration, commemorating Queen Victoria's visit to Perth in 1842. Well, I'm now going to move a lot further north, and this is the Shetland side of my story coming in now, to another collection of civic stained glass windows, and actually ones which are rather finer than Perth's, and these are in Lerwick Town Hall. Now, for a small island community, Shetland clearly has strong emotional links with its medieval and Norse past, and it also had the civic spirit to commission and find the funding for a very impressive recreation of the figures of its past history. But of course the Northern Isles had a medieval past which was recorded in the Norse sagas and available and easily accessible for the general population to read once the Orkney saga had been translated in the late 19th century, and of course, I mean, those who could read Latin or Old Norse could have read it earlier. The saga provided the local people of the islands with, it's been said, a brilliant portrayal in a living tongue of the deeds of their ancestors, of which any Scottish historian is rightly envious, and that was written not by any Scottish historian, but by Professor Archie Duncan. This would have been invaluable for any local community, but for the islanders on the remote northern edge of Scotland, it was a treasure of immense worth, which gave them an identity different from all other parts of Scotland, which raised them onto a very elevated plane of historical consciousness. And I think this historical consciousness gave them a distinctive identity which was useful in a world in which that identity might be, perhaps was, threatened, and that is the dominant culture of their Scottish neighbours. So this element of commemoration of a community's medieval past to maintain its distinctiveness is, I think, very relevant in many of these communities. In the instance of Shetland in relation to Scotland, in the instance of Scotland in relation to the wider world, perhaps. So when Lerwick's Town Hall was built, it was decided to represent figures and scenes from the Saga age in the windows. And this initiative was the responsibility of a remarkable local historian and antiquarian called Arthur Lorenson. I'm just going to put some of these images on. This is one showing the landing in Shetland of the first Earl of Orkney in AD 870. Well, actually he wasn't the first Earl, his brother became the first Earl, but he accompanied Harold Finehair on the King's Expedition West, and here we have a fine image of Harold Finehair on the left with perhaps a pigeon on top of him, or maybe, I think, meant to be a raven. And this shows an image of the investiture of the Earls. Well, it's a later image because there's a bishop and the king looking very medieval in the background, and the Earl taking an oath on some sort of shrine. So the role of the Earls is given a big focus here, although in actual fact the Earls, Shetland was not so important in the earldom. Well, I shouldn't say that because I think there are Shetlanders here who would no doubt object to that statement. We know less about the role of Shetland in the earldom of Orkney because the saga itself is much more concerned with Orkney, which was the centre of the earldom power and its zone of operations. Then, of course, we have the representation of Earl Magnus, Earl and Saint, and we have a very fine image in the centre of the founding of the cathedral, with the bishop on the left, and probably Earl Ronald's father, who is said in the saga to have been responsible for drawing up the plans for the cathedral, sitting there with the plans in front of him. And on the right is Bishop William, who was the bishop involved in the creation of the St Magnus Cathedral and the development of the cult of St Magnus as well. Then we have the coronation. No, we don't. We have Olaf Tryggvason and Tura. Yes, this is another aspect of these pictures which is very interesting. Arthur Lorenson looked beyond Shetland. He looked to Orkney, but he also looked to Norway and the incidents in Norway's history as being very relevant to his recreation of Shetland's past. Here we have King Olaf Tryggvason, who was relevant in Shetland and Orkney's history, but his wife Tura, I don't think had any relevance at all. She was the daughter of King Harold of Denmark, but here she is in all her pre-Raphaelite beauty. And then we have the scene which is very surprising to me to be represented, the coronation, the consecration of King Magnus Erlingsson, which took place in 1163. and which really has very little to do with Shetland or Orkney, but according to Arthur Lorenson, this must have been an important incident in Shetland's history, in Norway's history, so he decided to include it, and an image of Eystein Erlendsson, the Archbishop of Nidaros of the time as well. Olaf Haraldsson, king and saint, is shown, as is Håkon Håkonsson, looking very fierce, the king, of course, who was defeated at the Battle of Largs. Each window was funded by a different Shetland landowner or official, or a burghel or commercial organisation. And in the Maid of Norway, the window was presented by the royal borough of Kirkwall, where, of course, the maid died in 1290 on her way to Scotland to take up, to be consecrated queen. The work of these windows is really magnificent. Close-up, I think, shows you the superb craftsmanship, and there appear to have been two firms involved in the creation of these windows, Messrs. Ballantyne of Edinburgh and Messrs. Cox, Son and Buckley of London, and it is possible to distinguish which windows must have been created by which firm. Then we have James III of Denmark, Norway, of course, important figures because it was in the marriage that Orkney in 1468 and Shetland in the following year were pledged to Scotland instead of Margaret's dowry. So this is a magnificent recreation of the medieval past, of the northern, the Scandinavian north of Scotland, which deserves to be much better known. And I hope next time you visit Lerwick, you'll go into the town hall and have a look at them, have a look at these windows for yourselves. And I'm very grateful to Brian Smith for supplying me with all these images of the stained glass windows. Orkney has nothing of quite the same visible commemoration of their medieval past as a commemoration, but of course they have their own medieval icon, St Magnus's Cathedral, so perhaps they didn't have to recreate and commemorate the past in quite the same way. But Orkney has been very active in organising conferences commemorating historic events in the island's history. In 1963, the 600th anniversary of King Haakon's expedition was commemorated with a conference. In 1968, the 500th anniversary of the Pageant of Orkney, and then in 1987, as you can see here, the 850th anniversary of the founding of St Magnus's Cathedral. All wonderful commemoration events. Just this, a fine carved stone bench was erected at Kirkhope in Walls on the island of Hoy, which shows the story of Earl Sigurd's conversion. This is the second Earl Sigurd, and he was converted by Olaf Tryggvason in 995 or 996, and this was the arrival of formal Christianity in the islands. This bench has come out of the Scarpa Partnership project, which is bringing communities around Scarpa Flow closer together. It doesn't specifically commemorate the date of that conversion, although it's one of several monuments which are commemorating historical events round the flow. And the medallions have different scenes from the conversion story. This one showing Earl Sigurd being brought before Olaf Tryggvason and forced to convert at the point of the sword. So this is another very recent commemorative creation which has happened in Orkney. There was well, I'm now going back to Shetland because one cannot not mention perhaps what is the most famous annual commemorative event of any medieval commemorative event of any in Scotland, and that is Up Heliar. So I'm just going to move rapidly over these dramatic scenes, but and just to add my own comment that this whole festival, this whole annual festival represents an intensely local awareness of Shetland's Viking heritage, just as the stained glass windows do in the town hall. And it's a most impressive display of community spirit and organisation. The accuracy of the display and costume are not matters which worry them overmuch. The bigger the winged helmet, the better. But it's an annual ritual which must imprint strong impressions of their heritage on the minds of the young, just as the annual riding of the marchers does in the borders communities as well. Now I'm just turning very briefly to my own commemorative, recently completed commemorative activity on the island of Papastua, still in Shetland. which is a partial replica of a log-timbered building, which is referred to in a document of 1299. And we reconstructed this wooden building on the island of Papastur, and it is an enormous help. That recreation, which does commemorate the reference to this wooden building in the document of 1299, is an enormous help for the islanders to realise the significance of their island in the medieval past, and also to help tourism and to bring visitors into the island as well. Now, I'm going, just finally, if I'm allowed to have a few more minutes, to, and shamelessly, I have to admit, to publicise a new commemorative event which I am getting involved in at the present moment, and that is to to commission a memorial statue of Bishop Henry Wardlaw, the founder of the University of St Andrews, in 1412. This is a plaster head which has been modelled by the sculptor David Annand, which is going to form the basis for that statue. And I just wanted to tell you a bit about this, because it is quite an extraordinary story in many ways. We hope the statue will be erected in St Mary's College here, which is where Wardlaw's original foundation was located. His pedagogy, as it's referred to, was certainly in the place where St Mary's College is now located, which is later in date. But we have the most amazing surviving relics of Wardlaw's own effigy and fragments of his tomb. This is the head of a bishop, and it's pretty certain that it's his Bishop Henry Wardlaw, because there is also the fragment of the torso, which shows him in his mass vestments with the Wardlaw coat of arms at the base of the chasuble, which you just see round there. So quite extraordinarily, this survived in order to make us certain that this does represent the effigy of that bishop. I should say that these fragments, these relics of his tomb, were found in different places in the town and in the cathedral wall around the precinct wall around the cathedral. This fragment of the torso was found when a window was being repaired in a house in South Street in the 1940s. It had been used as a lintel to the window, and fortunately, I suppose, that had in some way protected and preserved it, and it is now in the Cathedral Museum. And I'm happy to tell you that Historic Scotland have agreed to conserve these fragments and to redisplay them for the 600th anniversary of the university's foundation. But there is one more stone which is little known and not appreciated, and which I knew nothing about until I embarked on finding out more about Bishop Henry Wardlaw. This is a stone which was found in the floor of a shop in South Street, and when it was turned over, it was realised that this was the coat of arms of Bishop Wardlaw. The top of the stone shows the bishop's mitre, and on the basis of it, on the bottom half of it, there is the inscription H.W. Fundato Loci, the founder of this place. That is Henry Wardlaw, and I don't think any other such stone exists in any other university that I know of, and I think it's something we should all be aware of, and which I hope by going into this statue project we'll all become more aware of. So shamelessly, again, I have to say I have brought some flyers, and I've deposited some on the table at the front here. I've put some on the table in the hall, which gives details of the project and invites you to contribute towards the cost of the statue. And on that shameless note, I'll end, and thank you very much for listening.